The Call of the Wild by Jack London. Chapter 1, The Lesson. Buck did not read the newspapers. If he had, he would have known that trouble was brewing for strong, long-haired dogs like him. Gold had been found in the Arctic, so thousands of men were rushing north to make their fortune. These men needed dogs, but not just any dogs. They wanted strong, heavy dogs like Buck to carry their loads. They also wanted dogs with thick, furry coats like Buck's that could withstand the cold and frost of the North Country. Buck lived in a big, sunny house in Santa Clara Valley, California. Judge Miller's place, it was called. It stood far back from the road, hidden among the bushes and poplar trees that surrounded it. A gravel driveway wound through the trees and up to the front of the house. Behind the house stretched a spacious lawn that seemed to go on forever. Yet, one could tell that it did not, from the orchards and berry patches that grew along its border. And beyond these were the kennels, the great stables, the servants' cottage, and the other buildings that belonged to the Miller family. All of this was Buck's territory. He was born, and here he was born, and here he had lived for the 4 years of his life. Of course, there were other dogs on the property, but they did not count. Some, like Toots, the pug, and Yazbel, the Mexican hairless, lived dull, spoiled lives in the house. They were hardly ever seen putting their noses out of doors. Then others, like the fox terriers, spent their lives outside, but they were kept in kennels. Buck, on the other hand, was neither a house dog nor a kennel dog. Buck ruled both worlds, and his was a grand life. He would swim with the judge's sons and take walks with the judge's daughter. At night he would lay at the judge's feet as he and the judge shared the warmth of the fireplace together. He was king, that is, king over all things on Judge Miller's place, including people. Buck's father, Elmo, was a huge Saint Bernard who had been Judge's most faithful friend. Now, Buck was following in his father's footsteps. At 140 pounds, he was not as large as his father. His mother, Shep, was a smaller Scotch shepherd. Still, Buck was a strong, heavy dog. His size and dignity gave him the right to walk like royalty around the place. Yet, he never let himself become a spoiled house pet. Hunting and racing had kept the fat off and the muscles hard. That was Buck in the fall of 1897, when gold was pulling men northward. But Buck did not know about the gold rush, nor did he know that Manuel, the gardener, spelled danger. Manuel loved to gamble, yet his wages were too small for such a hobby. His downfall was that he was always sure he would win. One fateful time, he did not. The judge and his family were gone for the night, and the night of Manuel's crime. No one saw the gardener take Buck through the orchard and off into the darkness. Buck thought he was going for a walk. And only one man saw Buck and Manuel arrive at the railroad tracks. This man talked with the gardener for some time. Then money passed between the two. "Wrap up the goods," the man said gruffly. So Manuel wrapped a thick rope around Buck's collar, which Buck allowed him to do so. Buck trusted the man he knew. "Twist the rope and you'll choke him," said Manuel. But when the rope was handed to a stranger, Buck growled angrily. Around the judge's place, such a growl was in order, but to Buck's surprise, the growl only tightened the rope further, cutting off his breath. In a rage, Buck leapt at the man. The man threw Buck to the ground, tightening the rope more. Buck fought back furiously, his tongue hanging out of his mouth, his chest panting for air. Never had he been treated this way. Never had he been so angry. Finally, Buck's strength left him. His eyes became blank. Later, when the train came, the two men threw him into a baggage car. The next thing Buck knew, his tongue was hurting and he was being jolted along in some kind of motion. Then, the sound of the train whistle told him he was on a train. He opened his eyes and stared like a kidnapped king. His royal eyes filled with anger as the man he spotted grabbed for his throat. But Buck was too quick for the man. His jaws bit savagely into the stranger's hand. Then he was choked out again and he blacked out. Just then, a baggage man who had heard their struggle came to check on things. "Yep, that dog has fits," said the Buck's captor as he hid his bloody hand from view. "Taking him to Frisco. Dog doctor there. Thinks he can cure him." With that, the baggage man left Buck and the stranger alone. Later that night, Buck was taken to a saloon on the San Francisco waterfront. A meeting took place in the shed behind the saloon. There, Buck's captors talked with the owner of the saloon about his trip. "All I get is $50 for it," he grumbled. "I wouldn't do it again for $1,000 in cold cash." His hand was wrapped up in a bloody rag. His pants were badly ripped. The kidnapper unwrapped his hand and looked at his injury. "If I don't get rabies from this," the owner of the saloon only laughed. "If you don't, it'll be because you were born to hang." Dazed and in great pain, Buck tried once more to attack his enemies. Again, he was thrown down and viciously choked. The men held him down and removed his collar and the rope. Then he threw him into a wooden cage. Buck lay in the cage for the rest of the night, angry and ashamed. He could not understand what was happening to him. What did these strange men want with him? Why was he being kept in a cage? When he heard the door open again, Buck jumped to his feet. He thought he was finally going to see his friend, the judge, again. But it was only the saloon owner looking in at him by the sickly light of a candle. Buck's throat twisted into a growl. The next morning, 4 men came to pick up Buck's cage. They were evil-looking men, ragged and dirty. These were more men who were bound to hurt him, Buck decided. He snarled at them through the bars of the cage. They only laughed and poked sticks at him. Buck grabbed the sticks with his teeth, but when he saw that the men wanted him to grab the sticks, he quickly lost interest and lay down quietly. Buck's cage was then lifted into a wagon. From there, he began to pass through many hands. Clerks in an office carted him around in another wagon. Then a truck carried him to a ferry boat. From the boat, he was trucked off to a train station. Finally, he was placed in an express car. For 2 days and nights, the express car was pulled along by a shrieking engine. The entire time, Buck neither ate nor drank. Train clerks would come and go, but Buck greeted them with angry growls, and the men reacted by teasing and laughing at him. They barked like dogs, flapped their arms, and howled. It was all very silly, Buck thought. It was an insult to his dignity. But he was glad about one thing. The rope was off his neck. Now he would show them. They would never get a rope around his neck again. Buck's throat and tongue were sore and raw from lack of water. His bloodshot eyes were filled with anger. And now the judge himself would not have known Buck. The clerks were glad to unload him from the train when the train arrived in Seattle. 4 men carefully carried the cage to a small walled yard. There was a stout man in a red sweater signed the driver's book. A stout man in a red sweater signed the driver's book. This was the man, Buck decided. He was the new enemy. Buck flung himself savagely against the bars. The man smiled grimly and picked up a club and a hatchet. "You ain't going to take me out, are you?" the driver asked. "Sure. You ain't going to take him out, are you?" the driver asked. Sure, the man answered, as he pried at the bars with the hatchet. Immediately, the 4 other men scattered. Safely on top of the wall, they waited to watch the show. Meanwhile, Buck rushed at the bars, sinking his teeth into the wood. He snarled as the hatchet fell on the cage. Buck wanted to get at the man in the red sweater as much as the man wanted to get at him. Now, you red-eyed devil, the man said, as he made a large opening in the cage. Then he dropped the hatchet and took the club in his right hand. Buck was truly a red-eyed devil by now. His hair stood up, his mouth foamed, and his bloodshot eyes glittered. He threw his 140 pounds of fury straight at the man. But in midair, Buck received a blow that jarred his teeth. He whirled over and fell to the ground. He had never been struck with a club in his life. He could not understand what was happening. With a snarl, he rose to his feet and again threw himself at the man. Again, a crushing blow sent him to the ground. He was mad with rage. Again and again he charged. Each time the club smashed him down. After one very hard blow, Buck could only stagger to his feet. He was too weak to attack again. Blood flowed heavily from his nose, mouth, and ears. His beautiful coat was splattered with blood and drool. But the man in the red sweater did not stop. He moved towards Buck again and leveled a frightening smash across his nose. Buck had never known pain like this before. With a lion-like roar, he hurled himself at the man again, but the man only shifted the club to the other hand, and caught Buck hard below the jaw. The upward force of the blow sent Buck circling in the air. He crashed to the ground on his head and chest. One last time, Buck rushed. Then the man struck a crushing blow that he had been saving for last. Buck went down, knocked out cold. "He's some dog breaker, I'd say," said one of the men on the wall. Slowly, Buck regained his senses, but he was still too tired and hurt to move. He lay still, watching the man in the red sweater. "Answers to the name Buck," the man announced as he read the note on the wooden crate. "Well, Buck, my boy, we've had our little meeting," he went on. "Best thing now is to let it go at that. You've learned your place, and I know mine. Be a good dog, and all will go well. Be a bad dog, and I'll beat the stuffing out of you. Understand?" As he spoke, the man patted Buck's bloodied head. Buck stiffened, but was too hurt to move. When the man brought food and water, Buck ate and drank eagerly. He was beaten, he knew that, but he was not broken. He had learned a lesson that he would not forget for the rest of his life. He saw that he stood no chance against the man with the club. The club, however, was only his first lesson in the rules of survival. Life would be crueler now, but he would face it bravely. He would also face it with all the craftiness he owned. The Call of the Wild by Jack London. Chapter 2, The Law of Club and Fang. As the days passed, other dogs came in crates and at the end of ropes. Some came quietly, others came in a fierce rage, the way that Buck had come. Buck watched as each dog fell under the club of the man in the red sweater. Each time, Buck learned the lesson all over again. A man with a club is a master to be obeyed. From time to time, strangers came and talked to the man in the red sweater. After the strangers had paid their money, they left with dogs. Buck wondered where they went, since they never came back. Each time he was glad that it was not he who had been chosen. He was afraid of the unknown. Finally, Buck's time did come, however. One day, a little man who spoke broken English saw him. The man cried out, "That one's good bully dog, eh? How much?" 300, and a bargain at that, the man in the red sweater replied. Since it's the government's money, you got no gripe, eh, Parlette? Perrault. Perrault smiled. The price of dogs had gone sky high. It was a fair price for such a fine animal. Canada would not lose in the deal with such a dog. Government messages would not be slowed down. Buck watched the money pass between the two men. He was not surprised when he and Curly, a good-natured dog, were led away. The two were loaded on a ship that soon headed north. From the deck, Buck and Curly watched Seattle disappear behind them. It was the last of the warm South either of them would ever see. Perrault turned the dogs over to a giant man named Francois. These men were a new breed to Buck. He did not really like them, but he did respect them. He quickly learned that they were fair men who punished justly. They knew too much about dogs to be fooled by one of them. Below deck, Buck and Curly met two other dogs. One was a snow-white fellow. He seemed friendly, but he was really shy and tricky. At the first meal, he stole Buck's food. Buck started after the thief. Before he reached him, Francois' whip flashed through the air. It reached the thief before Buck did. Buck had only to pick up the stolen bone. Watching the way Francois handled things, Buck's respect for him grew. Dave, the second dog, wanted only to be left alone. He was a gloomy-looking fellow, and let Curly know that there would be trouble if anyone bothered him. He ate and slept and yawned in between, taking no interest in anything. Buck and Curly were wild with fear when the boat rolled through the water, but Dave just raised his head, yawned, and went back to sleep. Day and night, the ship was pushed along by its propellers. One day was much like another. Buck felt the weather grow slowly colder. At last, one morning, the engines became quiet. Buck and all the other dogs were excited. Some change was coming. Francois put the dogs on leashes and led them on to the shore. Buck's feet sank into something white, soft, and damp. He jumped back. More of this strange substance was falling through the air. Buck sniffed at it and licked it with his tongue. At first it stung a bit. In the next second it was gone. Buck was puzzled. The men laughed at him loudly. He felt ashamed. But he did not know why. Buck had experienced snow for the first time. Buck's first day on Dia Beach was a nightmare. Every hour was filled with shock and surprise. Buck, who had suddenly been jerked from a life of care and respect, was thrown into a world of cruelty and violence. Here, there was neither peace nor safety. Life and limb were always in danger. These dogs and men were not town dogs and men. They were savages. Who knew no law, but the law of club and fang. Buck had never seen dogs fight as these dogs did. Soon he learned a lesson that he would never forget. Curly, in her usual friendly manner, approached a husky the size of a wolf. There was no warning, only a sudden leap and a gash of teeth. In an instant, Curly's face was ripped open from eye to jaw. 30 to 40 huskies surrounded the two fighters. They stood with a silent passion, licking their chops. Buck did not understand. Curly rushed the husky, who struck again, then leaped aside. On her next rush, Curly was knocked to the ground, and she never got up. This was the other huskies had been waiting for. They all closed in on her, yelping and snarling. Curly was buried, screaming in agony beneath the mass of attacking dogs. Buck was stunned by what he had seen. Spitz, a particularly cruel dog, hung out his tongue as if to laugh. Then Francois, swinging an axe, sprang into the pack. 3 other men used their clubs to help scatter the dogs. It did not take long. When the last husky was clubbed away, Curly lay limp and lifeless in the bloody snow. She had nearly been torn to pieces. Francois stood over Curly's body and cursed loudly. Often, this picture has come back to disturb Buck's sleep. So, that was the way it was. No fair play. Once down, that was the end of you. Well, he would make sure that he never went down. Spitz hung out his tongue and laughed again. From that moment on, Buck bitterly hated Spitz. Before he could recover from Curly's tragic death, Buck got another shock. Francois put straps and buckles around him. He had seen horses in such harnesses at home. Now, like the horses, he and the other dogs were strapped together and put to work hauling wood. Buck found this work embarrassing, but he was too wise to rebel. He buckled down and did his best. But it was so strange to him. Francois demanded that his commands be obeyed immediately. Since he had a whip, all the dogs obeyed. Dave, who had been placed behind Buck, had done this many times before. He nipped at Buck's legs whenever Buck made a mistake. Spitz was the lead dog and was as experienced as Dave. He could not always get at Buck, so he growled and jerked Buck in the direction he should go. Buck learned quickly. He soon knew to stop at ho and to go ahead at mush. Perrault was in a hurry to be on the trail to deliver his dispatches. This afternoon, he brought in 2 more dogs, Billy and Joe. They were true huskies. Even though they were brothers, they were as different as night and day. Billy was very good-natured, but Joe was sour and always snarling. Buck welcomed them, but Dave, as usual, paid no attention. Spitz immediately attacked Billy. When Billy turned to run, Spitz's sharp teeth sank into his side. Knowing he was next, Joe whirled to face Spitz. Joe's hair stood up, his ears lay back, his lips snarled, and his eyes gleamed in a threatening way. Spitz backed away. But to cover his retreat, he turned again to Billy, driving him away. Even though Perrault brought in another dog, it was old, tough-looking husky. His battle-scarred face had just one eye, but that eye flashed a warning that the other dogs respected. He was called Solek's, which means the angry one. When he marched among the dogs, even Spitz left him alone. Solek's did not like dogs to approach him from his blind side. Buck learned that lesson the hard way. When he came up on Solek's blind side, Solek whirled upon him and slashed his shoulder to the bone. From that time forward, Buck kept away from Solek's blind side, and they had no more trouble. Like Dave, Solek seemed to want just one thing, to be left alone. But time would show that both Dave and Solek wanted something else even more.